Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 41st week of 2015. I'm Carl Estabrook. For 25 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, but I was deplatformed there. Deplatforming is a recent coinage in the university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, Karen Aram, Ron Zoke, and I will try to say some true things. It's October 9th. On this date in 1997, Dario Fo received the Nobel Prize for Literature, when the Nobel Committee was less concerned with pleasing the rulers of the U.S. and the EU than it is now. They seem to be concerned about that with this year's selection for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Svetlana Alexievich, called the Belarusian Voice of Survivors. She says about her work, and I quote, "If you look back at the whole of our history," she was born in Ukraine, lives in Belarus. "If you look back at the whole of our history, both Soviet and post-Soviet, it is a huge common grave and a bloodbath, an eternal dialogue of the executioners and the victims, the accursed Russian questions, what is to be done and who is to blame. The revolution, the gulags, the Second World War, the Soviet-Afghan war hidden from the people, the downfall of a great empire, the downfall of the great socialist land, the land utopia, and now a challenge of cosmic dimensions, Chernobyl. This is a challenge for all the living things on Earth. Such is our history. And this is the theme of my books. This is my path, my circles of hell, from man to man," close quote. That's from Svetlana Alexievich, recently awarded this year's Nobel Prize in Literature, and remarkably consistent with the immense American media campaign to demonize all things Russian. That's hard to separate from the current politics of the United States and the demand that the economic integration of Eurasia be subordinated to American worldwide economic control. The situation was different, perhaps, in 1997 when Dario Fo received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Fo is an Italian actor and playwright of leftist sympathies and whose work has had a major political effect in its production around the world, not primarily, not often in the United States. His best-known play from 1974 is a thing called Can't Pay, Won't Pay, which is a critique of austerity. Austerity before the fact in Europe, or austerity as the neoliberal wave was beginning in Europe. His other well-known play is called The Accidental Death of an Anarchist. The title is ironic because it has to do with what was apparently a police killing of an Italian political figure, made to look like an anarchist. The guy jumped out of a 9th floor window through a full pane of glass, according to the police. But the play was once again a political event in Italy and in Europe. Fo has been called arguably the most widely performed contemporary playwright in world theater, and much of his work depends upon clowning, improvisation. the recovery of what's been called illegitimate forms of theater, such as those performed by the giullare, the medieval strolling players, and most famously the Italian style of commedia dell'arte, which just recently we've begun to understand was extremely important for the foundation of Shakespeare's work, or of the man who actually wrote the Shakespeare plays. Foe has said, every artistic expression is either influenced by or adds something to politics. And that's one of the reasons, perhaps, that figures like Graham Greene never received a Nobel Prize for Literature. His politics were too left. We also got a Peace Prize from the Nobel Committee this week, and the Peace Prizes are even more laughable than the literature prizes. But in this case, they seem to have picked something, perhaps from an attack of conscience, that is important. They gave the Peace Prize to the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet, an set of institutions that arose from the Arab Spring, which itself began in Tunisia. As I say, is an honorable exception to the list of people who have received the Nobel Peace Prize. A generation ago, the satirist Tom Lehrer said that political satire became obsolete when Henry Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which happened in 1973. 35 years later, upon his election, Barack Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and we have the phenomenon now on scene before the present day of one Nobel Peace Prize winner bombing another Nobel Peace Prize winner, Doctors Without Borders, whose hospital was attacked by the American military this last week in Kunduz in Afghanistan. This is certainly a contradiction to the notion of the Peace Prize. An interesting side note to this is that the controversy over the Peace Prizes, and in this case the one for the European Union, is coming up with the lawsuit about initiated by Merid Maguire, a Nobel laureate, David Swanson, and Jan Oberg in Sweden, against the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. What this group, which together are called the Nobel Peace Prize Watch, have done is sued the Nobel Peace Prize Committee on the misappropriation of funds. That is, they have used the funds out of Alfred Nobel's estate, which are supposed to support the Peace Prize, to give prizes to, in this case, the EU, which doesn't deserve it, according to the committee, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. The courts are actually considering this. A court is actually considering this, and it's certainly an interesting way to raise the question about the Peace Prize. All of this put me in mind of a political discussion on one of the major works of modern literature, which I will quote as follows. "In that case," said the dodo solemnly, rising to its feet, "I move that the meeting adjourn for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies." "Speak English," said the eaglet. "I don't know the meaning of half those long words, and what's more, I don't believe you do either." And the eaglet bent down its head to hide a smile. Some of the other birds tittered audibly. "What I was going to say," said the dodo in an offended voice, "was the best thing to get us dry would be a caucus race." "What is a caucus race?" said Alice. Not that she wanted much to know, but the dodo had paused as if it thought that somebody ought to speak, and no one else seemed inclined to say anything. "Why," said the dodo, "the best way to explain it is to do it. And as you might like to try the thing yourself some winter day, I will tell you how the dodo managed it. First, it marked out a race course in a sort of circle. The exact shape doesn't matter, it said, and then all the party were placed along the course here and there. There was no 1, 2, 3 and away, but they began running when they liked and left off when they liked, so that it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they'd been running they had been running half an hour or so and were quite dry again, the dodo suddenly called out, "The race is over," and they all crowded around it, panting and asking, "But who has won?" This question the dodo could not answer without a great deal of thought, and it sat for a long time with one finger pressed upon its forehead, the position in which you usually see Shakespeare in the pictures of him, while the rest waited in silence. At last the dodo said, "Everybody has won, and all must have prizes." "But who is to give the prizes?" quite a chorus of voices asked. "Why, she, of course," said the dodo, pointing to Alice with one finger, and the whole party at once crowded around her, calling out in a confused way, "Prizes, prizes!" Alice had no idea what to do, and in despair she put her hand in her pocket and pulled out a box of comfits. Luckily the salt water had not got into it, and handed them round as prizes. There was exactly one apiece all around. "But she must have a prize herself, you know," said the mouse. "Of course," the dodo replied very gravely. "What else have you got in your pocket?" he went on, turning to Alice. "Only a thimble," said Alice sadly. "Hand it over here," said the dodo. Then they all crowded around her once more, while the dodo solemnly presented the thimble, saying, "We beg your acceptance of this elegant thimble." And when it had finished this short speech, they all cheered. Alice thought the whole thing very absurd, but they all looked so grave that she did not dare to laugh, and as she could not think of anything to say, she simply bowed and took the thimble, looking as solemn as she could. So you're watching News from Neptune, a Prizes for Art and Murder edition, or the Thimble edition if you prefer. And we'll start with Ron Zook.
Well, today I want to comment briefly and I'm sure unconvincingly on the three American obsessions, money, guns, and sex, and have some recent notes on each of those themes. Concerning gun deaths, apparently they've been on the decline overall in American society, although that's very hard to believe, but that's what the statistics seem to show, except among the police, where they have shot up considerably. The Census Bureau, I believe it is, reports that there were gun deaths caused by guns at the rate of average of 92 a day in the USA in 2013. They don't have more recent statistics. About a third of those were homicides, and 2/3 were suicides. Curiously, that Americans are killing themselves at the rate of about 60 per day. It's estimated that there are 300 million guns in the USA. There are plenty of them everywhere, and this has raised the question among a number of social commentators and pundits about whether guns are so abundant now that they're everywhere, they're at hand, and people want them to be even more abundant everywhere, telling us that every time there's a victim of gun violence, that it could have been prevented if everyone were armed, if everyone had concealed carry, and there were more guns all around. I think that's utter nonsense, but it's being peddled as a serious proposition in some cases. Even Ben Carson, the presidential candidate, is saying that the Jews could have protected themselves from the Holocaust if they had all been armed, apparently, which is utterly crazy. But anyway, the latest news this morning, University of Northern Arizona University, 1 dead, 3 injured, shooting at their branch at Flagstaff, Arizona. And so it goes. We get the daily reports, the body counts of guns everywhere. So this notion that we all need guns because we're the good guys and we can gun down the bad guys, it seems to me utter nonsense. But anyway, for those who think that maybe it does have some merit, I'll report that online someone has proposed a National Machete Association, so that we should all be carrying machetes with which to protect ourselves. But my take on that is no. I'm starting the National Howitzer Association. I'll keep a howitzer in my garage so I can take out my neighbors who've been looking at me funny and I think maybe threatening my life. They're making me feel unsafe. And so, according to the current orthodoxy, this gives me the right to blow them all away with my howitzer. So I invite you to think about that. Planned Parenthood is about to get the Benghazi treatment. It became somewhat more explicit over the past week that the Republicans in the House of Representatives pointed to the success of the Benghazi Committee in bringing down Hillary's polling results. Hillary herself has shifted ground somewhat and now says she opposes the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well she should, and most people who are concerned about the welfare of average Americans are also doing, it seems. The Republicans, according to the daily news reports, are in disarray. The situation there has become completely chaotic, and it may lead to the destruction or elimination of the Republican Party, which I would be sad to see happen. A healthy democracy needs a reasonable opposition party. Any one person or party in power too long, I think, tends to become complacent and corrupt, and it needs to be challenged and opposed in some cases, but in a more sane and rational way. So is the USA starting to self-destruct? Well, so it appears. One symptom of that, I think, is the situation in higher education becoming more and more expensive for a lot of people and more treated as a commodity. So you pay your money and you get the result. This is the result of what's called rationality or cost-benefit thinking, is the notion that the only value of higher education is increasing your income, making more money for you in later life. So the cost of higher education has increased so much for most people that it's actually, despite all of the things you hear about scholarships and student loans and so on, it's created an enormous economic burden on a whole lot of people. So symptoms of this, again, here it is. Well, the typical household makes less than it did before the recession. Wall Street Journal, September 16th. The typical American household 6 years after the Great Recession is still worse off, according to the report released Wednesday. The Census Bureau reported that the median household income was $53,657 in 2014. That's less than the 2013 median of $54,462, but not statistically different. What is significant is that when adjusted for inflation, the median household generated 6.5 less than they did in 2007, the year before the recession. It's been found that even then, when there are loans and scholarships and grants covering all the expenses of sending one person, typically the first person in the family to go to college for a year, those people actually tend to drop out at an alarming rate because of the family situation. There were people in the family who lose their jobs, get sick, and so on. And covering the nominal expenses of tuition and the like for individual people going to college just doesn't begin to do it. Finally, with no other choice this news story says this student resorted to prostitution to meet NYU's soaring price. The day before classes started at New York University, there was an extraordinary rally in Washington Square Park to protest Wall Street's stranglehold on higher education. In several ways, this rally was unprecedented. First, it was a massing of communities, not only from one threatened university, but several institutions, starkly misdirected by their buccaneering boards and pampered managers, NYU, Cooper Union, and the New School, 3 downtown New York City schools, severely damaged by their trustees' serial construction plans and other wild investments. So this young woman made it known publicly that she was working her way through college by turning tricks and I guess defying anyone to say anything about that. One of these stories about some co-ed working her way through the University of Illinois turns up in the press every few months. And indeed, you can find out more about this by going on to Craigslist and looking under the appropriate headings. And I dare say you will find several students at the University of Illinois who are looking for sugar daddies. And the duties are not actually spelled out, but I think we all know what that means. So there you are. They are working their way through college, and the economic situation seems to demand that in many cases. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. I take it.
You think, right?
You haven't taken advantage of this situation.
Yeah,
I
right.
hope not,
Speaking,
yes.
you're not report. This is not reportage. I take it.
No,
You're
this
watching
is
news.
from Neptune.
You're watching news from Neptune, and we'll go to Karen Aram.
Okay, well, first, Ron, the title of your topics today reminds me of a book in the 90s that I read referring to Cambodia, Guns, Girls, and Ganja, which actually it's a very good read. I highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in Cambodia and the realities of the time, at that time. I also want to mention in commemoration of the Thailand massacre of October 6, 1976. That was this week, and it's something that is so abhorrent. I have a book here with photographs of that time, which I cannot even look at. What I really came here to talk about today, I talked about a lot on our Tuesday program at 10 in the evening, run again at 11 on Wednesday evenings on the same station. I talk about it a lot, just as I often refer to the pivot to Asia. This is Wall Street's Think Tank by Lawrence Shoup. This deals with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Empire of Neoliberal Geopolitics, 1976-2014. Now, I did not read his earlier work that he did with a gentleman whose last name I believe is Minter.
Yes.
And what was the title of that book? I have it written down somewhere. That was written about the CFR from, I think, the late 40s. I have it written down anyway, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's one I will have to read and see if I can glean a lot from that. But this book deals with an organization, and the reason why this is so important, by the way, it has an afterword here by Noam Chomsky, who I will read this. He says, "This is a revealing account of how a small group of planners, drawn from sectors of concentrated private and state power, closely linked, along with experts is in quotation marks, whose commitments are congenial to their ends, have set the contours for much of recent history, not least the neoliberal assault that has had a generally destructive impact on populations while serving as an effective instrument of class war. It's a welcome and valuable, very valuable contribution." And I find it's full of data regarding members of this organization. And there was a Counterpunch article written by a professor. I think the title of her article related to her review of this book was something about conspiracy no, conspiracy yes. Because some people might view this as a conspiracy, but when you read it, you see that it really, really is accurate. It lists the names of all of the individuals who are very, not all of the individuals, there are over 5,000 members of the CFR. There are so many corporations, there are many organizations, NGOs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some are merely members, some are very reigning members. For instance, we know that Robert Rubin, Alan Greenspan, Timothy Geithner, Leslie Gelb, these are top reigning members of the organization, very influential, and have had a very strong impact on Wall Street and, as a result, our foreign policy. We have names such as Richard Haas, we have Meade, Mendelbaum. There are so many people that are influential to our government. But what is and most of our presidents, Obama is not a member. There was one other person I can't remember who was not a member. Hillary Clinton, for instance, is not a member, but Bill Clinton has been a member for over 20 years, and their daughter is now a recent member. Yes, I think two other Republican candidates or Democrats they're actually more Democrats than Republicans. So what this organization represents is the influence upon our government and their foreign policy, as well as, that's why it's called Wall Street's think tank. I'm going to quote a couple things here, and for me this really explains a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of what we're dealing with. Now this was written by Meade. He talks about how in 2004, the early phase of the U.S. occupation of Iraq, okay, I won't talk about him so much, but again, he's a reigning member, a great influence. But he looks at the organization as having it has a collective perspective of a large segment of the Council's membership and top leadership. And he talks about four fundamental aspects of the U.S. grand strategy and global power. I've talked a lot about Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is also a very major influence within this organization. I've talked a lot in the past about the Grand Chessboard, which is a book written by, Brzezinski in 1997, which lays out the plan which we see unfolding now related to Eurasia, and it has to do with control of Russia and China and all other nations within their geopolitical strategic location. And that includes the Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, everywhere. One of the things that, he's a great influence, but here this takes it further to what they call four foundational aspects, of the grand strategy. Sharp power, military, geopolitical; sticky power, which is economic, geoeconomic; sweet power, soft, with all three together synergistically forming hegemonic power; an empire imposed by American power, but one in which many nations have a stake. Okay, now in his discussion of sharp power, Meade follows Brzezinski and the CFR capitalist class consensus on the power centrality of Eurasia, especially the eastern and western fringes of this vast supercontinent. Meade defines sticky power as the set of global economic institutions and policies that attract others into the U.S. capitalist system with incentives that make it difficult for them to leave. In defining, that's not mine, okay. Mine was doing it on Tuesday.
Mine's out there.
Okay, in defining sweet power, Meade closely follows Joseph Nye, Jr., who's also very influential. His ideas: positive values, ideals, and cultural precepts, such as women's rights and humanitarian assistance, peacefully draw others into support for the U.S.-dominated system. Immigration and foreign students studying in the United States also help. Why? Because then we can influence. The influence is a positive influence, and by that means we can further control. Now the final type is that of hegemonic power, empire. Brings the other three together, and this creates a whole bigger than the sum of its parts, resulting in consent and legitimacy. Hegemonic power also includes the ability to set the agenda, determining the framework for discussion and debate, something strived for by the CFR itself. So what the CFR represents, the majority of people involved in the CFR are people who they bring together because they want a consensus of opinion on the goals. But within that organization, they do allow a certain amount of dissent, but the dissent is only in regards to strategy. So they have these various different influential individuals offering their various different strategies. So this is why I think sometimes you will see, now he goes further on into the book and he talks about concerns for the environment and how, of course, they talk about, well, yes, we need to do something. However, you know, we don't want to impact on economics. What is quite interesting is that coal is not, the coal companies are not members of the CFR, okay? The coal corporations are not members of the CFR. And the only reason I mention this is because it's very possible at some point in the future we will start closing down our coal plants. They've done that in China. They closed down their last coal plant. But they're also doing the carbon tax form, which is certainly, it's a step in the right direction, but it's certainly not a solution by any means. So I'm thinking to myself, probably we will be looking at that as a step that the government may take regarding coal, but make no mistake, they are not going to do anything about oil. And that is why we're in the Middle East. We know that it's all about resources. And throughout the book, it's there. There is almost no humanitarian ideology here. Any benevolence that comes out of this is purely for pragmatic strategic purposes. Meaning, we don't want a lot of bad PR. We don't want fallback. I mean, I think, Carl, you've talked about this a lot. And this all started in the 70s, just about as you said, how the Reagan government, maybe it started with the Carter government, sending troops into Latin America. I think it was Reagan primarily, because they knew they didn't want protesters out in the streets, as we had in Vietnam. So we send them as undercover. I mean, there is nothing anywhere in here that shows any one of the advisors ever suggesting that covert operations or undercover operations were in any way not to be utilized. The only thing that they want utilized is sometimes soft power. But even when suggesting soft power or sweet power, yeah, I know, it's pretty despicable, really, when you read this and you see how they think. Now, Richard Haas, he wrote a book based on the CFR review, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, the case for putting America's house in order. And it begins with following assertions about the dangers facing a United States now in decline. But again, everything throughout is all about imposing privatization and neoliberal politics. And that's what neoliberalism is really all about. It's to, oh yes, the use of NGOs, I found that really disturbing. The use of NGOs is one of the means of utilizing a certain form of soft power. And this morning, there was an interview with Anthony Lowenstein on Democracy Now! By Amy Goodman in respect to his book that he just published, Disaster Capitalism. And he talks a lot about the use of NGOs throughout these nations that we have created and are now failed states, and how they have continued to fail as a result. We send in NGOs and all the profiteering that then takes place. We send in contractors. It's all about the profits of our corporations. But when you read this, you can see how it operates. You can see the way it is utilized. And it's pretty frightening. I do not come out of this with any positive sense of how to go about solving the problems or the issues. As I said, there's huge membership. Stephen Cohen, who was interviewed by a German newspaper, a German journalist, because he's not getting much coverage today in the U.S., primarily because he is opposed to what we're doing with NATO on the border of the Ukraine, of Russia. Stephen Cohen is a foremost authority on Russian studies here in the U.S., And it was pointed out that he is a member of the CFR. And he said, yes, but he said they don't, basically he's not someone that they listen to. So going through and just looking for the names, I mean, Samantha Power is not a member. I mean, isn't that nice? I know. But almost everyone is a member. And that is influencing our government. And it is pretty frightening. And when you'll start to read something that someone says and you think, oh, well, here's a voice of humanity and some sense. No. And then when you read further in, you see that it's just a smoke and mirrors form of giving more power, more hegemony, more taking over. And as I said, one moment they'll be saying, yes, we don't want blowback. We want to keep things, we want to offer all of these nice cultural incentives for people to want to be more like the U.S. And they do that. But when they do, it's a carrot-stick way. When there is any opposition, the opposition is put down, and it's put down in a very horrendous way. The use of military force, which is what we are now seeing in the U.S. We're not seeing it in Silicon Valley, but we are seeing that use of force by our police in poor neighborhoods where they can get away with it.
Thank you, Karen. It is surely just a coincidence that America's UN representative is named Power. She is normally described as crazy by one of the best reporters on these issues, Pepe Escobar.
Yeah.
And she is, if not a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, certainly a product of that
Yes.
world. She was for many years at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, which has been a center for the Council of Foreign
Yes.
Relations and the foreign policy intellectuals who make up that group. The book you were referring to earlier, Lawrence Shoupp's earlier book, Imperial Brain Trust, talks about the Council of Foreign Relations in the before and during the Second World War and immediately afterwards. And the book was extremely important because you'd think that one of the things you would look at if you wanted to know what the United States was doing around the world would be the things that were said by the folks who were making policy, the folks who were forming the policy, and that was what the Council of Foreign Relations was designed to bring together. In fact, very few people had looked at what the Council of Foreign Relations was saying before and after the Second World War, and Shoupp's book was a revelation when it came out. This book, the one you're talking about here, is important because it picks up the story from the post-war era and brings it down to the present century. It is an account of what the United States is doing around the world by the people who are doing it. I think you're quite right in pointing out its importance. I should mention that today, October the 9th, begins the 15th year of the war in Afghanistan. And it's important to reject the notion that we have heard from several people who have commented on the things we've had to say about this. This is somehow George Bush's war and belongs to an earlier administration. There's the elementary truth in that it was indeed George Bush who invaded Afghanistan in 2001, but the construction of American policy in Afghanistan goes back at least to the Carter administration, when the national security advisors of Brzezinski said that they had constructed jihadism, so to speak, and sent the most fanatical fighters they could find into Afghanistan before the Russian invasion of Afghanistan to, as Brzezinski said, give the Soviets a Vietnam of their own, close quote. And the result was the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, which was set up as a trap, according to Brzezinski's memory. One wonders how much that can be trusted, but it certainly was the case that the use of jihadism, indeed the construction of jihadism as American policy that America has repeated a number of times since then, including the situation in Iraq, where the U.S. encouraged the Sunni-Shia split and the construction of a jihadist response to the government in Iraq that had eventuated from the American invasion. So the willingness of the U.S. to use jihadism has been obvious. In fact, one could trace it back to the destruction by the United States of secular Arab nationalism in the 1950s and 60s, which led to the effective alliance between Israel and the U.S. when the 1967 war, precipitated by Israel, brought an end to the major secular Arab state, or the major secular Arab government at least, that is the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser. The use of jihadism has been a staple of American policy, literally for generations, and there are many people who suggest that that's indeed what's going on in Syria right now. The morning's news brings the account that the Obama administration has ended the Defense Department's $500 million program to train and equip Syrian rebels. And this is a result of the acknowledged failure of that program to do anything to accomplish what the real goal of American policy has been in the Middle East, that is to take advantage of the Arab Spring movement in order to produce biddable governments for the United States throughout the Middle East. In some cases, this has worked out as a result of a great deal of murder and mayhem, as in Egypt. But in Syria, where the U.S. has been moiling about for a while in order to make sure that a Syrian government is conversant with American wishes, it seems, at least for the moment, not to be working. For the second time, Russia has frustrated the American attempt to control the Soviet Union, leading to really quite a major admission by the Obama administration that this program to train moderate opponents of the Syrian government will be brought to an end. It was embarrassing enough when became clear last week that they had a total of 4 or 5 militants trained in this with these millions of dollars, and they can't be seen as a major force in the area. The U.S. was even made fun of by the normally phlegmatic foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, last week, who said, by the way, they would like very much to get in touch with the Free Syrian Army in order to coordinate opposition to the Islamic State in Syria. Could the United States please tell Mr. Lavrov where to find the Free Syrian Army and how to get in touch with them? It was counts as a joke, I guess, international relations, because everyone knew that the Free Syrian Army was a propaganda construct by the United States, not a real player in the Syrian situation. And so it comes really as a surprise to have the Obama administration admit that this program to form a moderate opposition in Syria, moderate is an American government term, of course, is coming to an end, particularly since the Congress is at the moment, or the House at the moment, is considering the NDAA, the defense bill for next year that includes another $500 million for these moderate Syrians. It's not at all clear whether that part of the bill will be rewritten, but the bill itself is a matter of struggle between the Republicans and Democrats in Congress at the moment, as the administration tries to cover over its, at best, confusing policy in Syria. You're watching News from Neptune. We have occasion to reflect on the policy of the American government in Syria this week, particularly since the rather remarkable events of the Russian engagement in Syria included Russia firing cruise missiles 1,000 miles across Iran and Iraq into Syria. And I think that came as a surprise, actually, to the United States that the Russians had this capability. There's been talk recently about the degree in which Russian missile technology, and Chinese as well, raises questions about the supposed American military control of the entire Eurasian landmass. And it's hard not to see the Russian attack in Syria as being a demonstration of what the situation actually is. So these things are all, as it were, implicated. And I think we will hear a good deal more about the Russian capabilities as the U.S. propaganda line continues to be the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. Comments, friends?
Yeah, you can find out a good deal about the sophistication of Russian weapons and air power and so on by going online. And it's quite amazing. I think many Americans believe that we are by far the most sophisticated builders and users of ultra-sophisticated air power. And you can quickly find out that the Russians are no slouch at all in that area. And it should raise some questions about the complacent assumption that we have such overwhelming military power that we can continue to challenge and bait the Russians. And they will have to acquiesce in this, which seems to be the view of a lot of people.
The reporter Pepe Escobar, who's written very well on these points, has been pointing out for a while that there is a certain Potemkin village quality to the American notion of its military control of what the Pentagon calls full spectrum dominance. Yeah. The spectrum being the spectrum of weapons and techniques useful for controlling the world. And certainly recent events at least raise questions about that, particularly since the U.S. Imperial doctrine, we might say, or imperial strategy, relies upon aircraft carriers. The U.S. has 12 aircraft carriers active, and more in mothballs, as a matter of fact, 12 aircraft carriers sorted around the world. No other country in the world has more than 2. And the Chinese don't, the Russians don't, and so on. The interesting, parenthetically here, the countries that have 2 aircraft carriers, you will never guess if you don't already know, the countries that have 2 aircraft carriers apiece are Italy and India. So make of that what you will. But if the U.S. imperial control of the world rests upon 12 aircraft carriers, which Escobar, among others, had been saying for a while are immensely susceptible to attack by the Russian missile technology. And it's hard not to see the attacks in Syria in the last couple of days as being a demonstration of at least the plausibility of that notion. So,
yeah, that was eye-opening, that they could fire these missiles about 1,000 miles with apparently perfect accuracy. They hit exactly what they wanted to hit.
Right.
And that's the point. The U.S., after a day of rumination on the point, finally said, well, look, some of these missiles crashed in Iran.
Yeah, right.
And the Iranians said, no, they didn't. So, I mean, there's a lot of positioning going on, not just of the missiles, but indeed of the arguments on both sides, I think.
Carl,
Yeah.
this morning I read in the, it came from Press TV. Mm-hmm. It was an interview with William Jones, a LaRouchian, former draft dodger who took up in Sweden. Mm-hmm. He and his group are now back in the U.S. They're all academics, evidently, and he's now in Leesburg. RT evidently interviews him frequently. He has claimed that we now have 2 battleships. The U.S. has 2 battleships in the, I think it's the South China Sea. Yeah, I could be wrong. It could be the Southeast China Sea, but I'm not sure now. But provoking China. And I just got that this morning. He doesn't say where the battleships are coming from. I assume it's from one of our military bases that is located there. We have so many military bases around the South China Sea area. So there are 2 battleships there now. Again, I'm waiting for word from others on this topic, and they're evidently headed towards one of the disputed islands.
Where was this? Where did you hear this report?
Well, I got it on Facebook, Press TV, or is it Channel 4 they call it? They interview people, and I posted it on Facebook. And the interview is with William Jones. So it's one of the RT. It's one of those that we get that's out of the norm. So, we'll see. I'm assuming, though, and I was thinking the same thing. It's like battleships, okay, whose battleships, where are they coming from? We know that, but they are U.S., that's what he's saying. So I'm still trying to, get a second opinion.
Yeah, I don't know quite what they mean by battleships. I mean, there are the U.S. has no active battleships in the world, and hasn't.
They're considered
really.
obsolete.
Exactly.
I know. So I posted it on Facebook.
I mean,
right.
The term is elastic. It could mean there are various and sundry other
that's what
sorts
I'm
of
thinking.
ships.
Yeah, that's what I'm
could be
thinking.
At stake here.
I think he may be like me. I use the term warships, or I use bombing when technically I may not be using, the right term. Maybe an airstrike, I just refer to it as a bombing because the results are the same.
Yeah.
Someone who has a history as a LaRouchian, as a follower of Lyndon LaRouche and so forth, does not inspire confidence on the face of it.
Didn't in me either. and so
but the question is an important one.
Yeah, so I was skeptical of that, as I am usually skeptical of most of these things. One thing I do want to point out in this book before I forget is that in Mandelbaum's book, I think he wrote, is it Goliath, or the Case for Goliath, yeah. He exalts and celebrates the American government, its additional verification of the CFR's promotion of a central role for the powerful state, together with the council itself, an organizer and enforcer of the neoliberal geopolitical empire. Now this is in sharp contrast with the more reactionary sector of the U.S. capital class, as represented by non-CFR big capitalists like the Koch brothers and libertarian think tanks like the Cato Institute that favor, promote, and work for a weaker central state with a much smaller domestic and global reach. I found that interesting. I don't understand it. It's something that, I don't know how important it is, but since there's so much out there all the time talking about the Koch brothers, and then we hear about the Cato Institute, Rand Paul was being supported by the Cato Institute in his bid for GOP presidency. So there's a lot in here that needs to be looked at and considered.
Yeah, one of the cliches of foreign policy, in almost all papers and books, they start out by pointing out that foreign policy is a reflection of domestic politics and so on. And the power struggles and shifts that go on domestically will quickly get reflected in
Actually, I think it's the reverse.
Military policy.
I think it's the reverse.
Well, okay.
I think now, and that's the impression I'm getting from this, I think now what we're looking at is that what's happening domestically is a result of so much of what is happening.
Well, certainly it's interactive.
As a result of
right?
our, yeah.
The influences go both ways, I'm sure. But again and again, you'll find this in the opening pages of almost everything on foreign policy, the extent to which it is a reflection of domestic political struggles.
Now, the bromide in American Cold War policy of 50 years ago even was politics stops at the water's edge. And that was coined, I think that goes back at least to the struggle between the Eisenhower administration and its critics in the Democratic Party. The notion was that whatever the domestic politics were, the threat of world communism was so great, i.e. the need for the U.S. to maintain the war footing that had solved the Depression during the Second World War was so great, that we couldn't have any real political differences on terms of what the U.S. does in the world at large. And that was used to put down a good bit of critique, a good bit of the critique of what the U.S. did during the Cold War. It may not be quite accurate, but it does point up the fact that what we take to be political divisions within American political parties really mean very little in terms of the a general agreement by the American political system that the U.S. must maintain an economic hegemony over the world that it achieved in the Second World War, and that anything that really challenges that, including Russian missiles from the Caspian Sea, have to be opposed with the united front of American political parties. I think that's an important point, and that when we begin to talk about what the U.S. is actually doing in the world at large, i.e., who is the U.S. actually killing in the world at large, what we should be aware of is the unity of American policy, regardless of whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration, and the consistency of that policy over time. For example, in the U.S. now, there are really only two candidates who oppose the, and then one of them is not even really a candidate, two candidates who oppose what the U.S. is doing in conducting its wars around the world. And those two are Ron Paul and Jill Stein of the Green Party. Ron Paul is not a candidate, and his son, Rand Paul, has abandoned a good bit of his father's objection to American foreign policy and support for American concerns. So even though President Obama is attacked by the Republicans for not being strong enough in the Middle East, not killing enough people, the fact of the matter is there's no real disagreement on the fact that we should keep killing people in the Middle East in order to defend this American economic position.
That's kind of my point, Carl, is that when you do read this, you cannot help but come to the conclusion that there's nobody opposing killing people in the Middle East if it meets our needs. The only opposition is, okay, maybe we don't want so much blowback, so maybe we should soften a little bit. And in fact, they refer to Obama as following that policy with the drones.
Yes, right.
Because there are fewer people aware of the wars that we are conducting through drone warfare.
That's the attraction of drone warfare. We can kill people without there being so much notice in this country of what's going on. I mean, it's clear that Obama has managed to distract the attention of many Americans from the fact that the war continues as it did under the previous administration.
Yeah.
You've been watching news from Neptune for the 41st week of 2015, a thimble edition for reasons that I tried to explain at the beginning. We quoted Dario Fo, that every artistic expression is either influenced by or adds something to politics. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Karen Aram and Ron Zook. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett, thanks to whom also this program will be available on YouTube. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.